So welcome to this, our last workshop session. This one is entitled Complex Post-Traumatic Stress and the Orthodox Moral Tradition, Critiques of Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives from Trauma Theory. And I'm delighted to introduce Kate McCray, who has a THM, a MDiv, and is a PhD candidate at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. She's also a member of Holy Mirror-Bearers Chapel at the University of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you. All right. I'm excited you guys came for this journey. It'll be a little bit of a whirlwind. I hope it'll be enjoyable. Okay, so every summer, local news stations cover the signs of drowning. It seems like an odd event to need to inform the public on something so basic. Don't we all know what drowning looks like? Flailing, struggling, floating on the surface of the water. As it turns out, unless a person is a trained responder, most people look for exactly those cues, which are fundamentally impossible for a person drowning. Every summer, children drown at family gatherings, surrounded by loved ones who later mourn with similar sentiments. I was right next to her, and I didn't realize that she was drowning. A drowning person looks lethargic, often with the nose and mouth barely below the surface of the water. Drowning is a disturbingly calm process, especially in a world where vigilant parents are looking for the exact opposite warning signs. Cultivated by dramatized drowning scenes in movies and after-school TV shows, we are so certain that we know what drowning looks like that we miss it completely. Mental illness is the same. Social expectations for a person in need or a person telling the truth often run counter to real-life abilities, causing would-be supporters to accuse the person with a mental illness of lying, attention-getting, or being dramatic. We default to our expectations and interpret the symptoms of illness as performance. And in fact, they are performing, desperately attempting to fit their symptoms into another's expectations to receive care. Because support is not optional. Support is a lifeguard in deep water. Support is air. Our imagined scenarios are merely composites of on-screen characterizations. They are fiction. But like every stereotype, it is hard to subvert expectation. Complex post-traumatic stress is a prime example of a mental illness that defies social expectation and continues to be under-supported. What we societally expect from adult behaviors is only made possible by the skills attained from early childhood attachment. Healthy family systems, like any system, feel normal and natural, and the skills gained from them seem to arise from the person as if they were innate. Like speaking, a parent might believe a child spontaneously learns the mechanisms of speech and communication. But any linguist can tell you that language acquisition is highly complex. The parent actually tailors her words to the child's stage of development in exact ways, though subconscious. If the child fails to acquire language, suddenly a family becomes aware of the systems at play. Attachment in childhood operates in a similar way, with normative structures of trust and protection seeming natural and innate for the vast majority of us. They seem like nothing more than the laws of science and gravity. Secure and healthy attachment cultivates trust, and in that relationship of trust, parental figures teach the child who and how they are. The concept of the self forms within these beliefs, and eventually when the child exerts independence from the parents to express autonomy, the idea of self-identity becomes individuated. The young adult's mechanisms to identify where they begin and others end directly come from healthy attachments earlier in life. Paradoxically, healthy independence is only possible because of stable and trustworthy dependence early in life. what attachment theorist John Bowlby calls secure attachment. In contrast, children who develop in environments marked with violence and neglect establish beliefs about the self that are unilaterally negative and based in rule systems set by abusive attachment figures. The modern field of trauma theory was largely set by researcher Bessel van der Kolk, who noticed the overlap between attachment theory, family systems theory, and trauma studies. He was one of the first to attempt delineation between soldiers with PTSD who were formerly healthy and had healthy attachment figures, and those for whom PTSD from war only added layers of complexity to their already established developmental trauma in childhood. One of van der Kolk's key contributions is the notion of intrusive and involuntary thoughts, where the majority of other specialists in trauma associate childhood violence with fear responses. Van der Kolk recognized that complex PTSD operates equally within the altered expression of love. The love from a child to a parent exists even in the environment of violence, and that complicated love continues into adulthood. This is a hard concept to grasp, that negative, intrusive, and self-loathing thoughts would not be primarily embedded in the adult psyche adjacent to anger, but also woven into love. So that as the adult lives the Orthodox life and connects meaningfully with others, the occasion of love might be as dangerous and regressive as aggression. How then can we interpret the ascetic tenets about controlling one's thoughts when there is an involuntary nature to intrusive recollections of the past, as well as an inverted and threatened reaction toward love? We all interpret one another in a highly complex network of social code, determining love, anger, annoyance, defiance, all from a web of facial expressions, movements, and verbal cues. If no conflict or friction arise between us, between the expectation and the experience, we may not even realize this social code is operating between us when we read a face or listen to a tone of voice or decipher meaning. When we interpret facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language in the same way that we do drowning, that is, with an incorrect set of assumptions, we fundamentally misunderstand a person who exhibits a different series of external cues to his or her own internal emotional experience. This is called affect dysregulation. Clinicians who study trauma were the first to note that the internal world of the patient strongly differed with their affect. In a typically developed adult without any clinical diagnoses, internal feeling and the expression of that feeling correspond. But for an adult who experienced extended violence and isolation in trauma, affect and internal emotion might not relate. For example, a person with complex PTSD might behave in such a way that he or she would be perceived as angry, annoyed, detached, aloof, confident, or even prideful, when internally the individual is actually experiencing fear or loss. These defense mechanisms for the child signal to the abuser that the child is strong or unaffected, and this helps the child protect the child from further violence. However, the defense mechanism that concealed fear in the context of parental violence matures with the child to become adult affect dysregulation. What kept the child alive now compromises the adult's ability to communicate need. Interpretation is the gatekeeper to help, and a gatekeeper that we often ignore. If we do not expect the real-life signs of drowning, we do not appropriately attribute urgency to a dying person. When it comes to the interpretation of others and their motives, as a gatekeeper to aid, affect dysregulation is one of the first signs misinterpreted as lying or manipulation. False interpretations and attributions of affect can also be laudatory. causing the adult with complex PTSD to seem confident, mature, and calm under pressure. Although socially praised as appearing resilient, this is also dysregulation as a result of cortisol acclimatization. In functional MRIs, the brain of adult victims of child abuse show changes to frontal lobe activity, which houses decision-making abilities as well as speech, especially spontaneous speech. And there are morphological changes in the hippocampus that result from childhood atrophy. The child's body adjusts to the violent environment by prioritizing caloric resources and essentially starving the areas of the brain that are unnecessary for short-term survival. The autonomic nervous system that handles fight or flight responses to stressful events becomes so accustomed to hyperactivity, kicking in every time there is an act of violence or neglect, every time the child has feared death, that it permanently alters the body's responses. In some adults, their changed psychological and physiological makeup result in an overreaction to stress stimuli. But for others, even very stressful life events do not rise to the level of reaction. The brain has adjusted to the high level of cortisol, the hormone that regulates stress to prevent the body from actually going into shock. For the victim of childhood abuse, everyday cortisol levels are higher than the average adult, and this can mean that the person with complex PTSD does not respond to otherwise threatening or high pressure situations, resulting in a cool, calm demeanor. Seen as a virtue, these low-reacting adults, appearing confident, in control, even when their behavior might include extreme risks or show other telltale signs of dysregulation, those around them often marvel at their collectedness and maturity. In 2007, Sean Penn released a movie adaptation of Jon Krakauer's international bestseller, Into the Wild. America was immediately gripped by the depiction of a young man, Christopher McCandless, who boldly cast off convention and traveled into the Alaskan wilderness. He was called a modern-day Thoreau, who defied social expectation to prioritize exploration, independence, and his own integrity. The movie description reads, freshly graduated from college with a promising future, 22-year-old Christopher McCandless, played by Emile Hirsch, instead walked out of his privileged life and into the wild in search of adventure. What happened to him on the way transformed this young wanderer into an enduring symbol for countless people. Was Christopher McCandless a heroic adventurer or a naive idealist, a rebellious 1990s Thoreau or another lost American son, a fearless risk-taker or a tragic figure who wrestled with the precarious balance between man and nature? After the book and movie caught my generation absolutely on fire with the desire to mimic this independent courage, Chris's younger sister published her own autobiography. Her brother, though bright and warm and complex, did not travel into the wilderness to find himself, at least not in the way that Krakauer depicted. In the beginning of Corinne's book, Krakauer introduces her autobiography with a foreword, explaining that while he was researching Into the Wild, Corinne disclosed private letters with Chris off the record. He became convinced that the letters he read from Chris proved the reason behind his journey into the wild, and that he could leave enough suggestion in the book to cause readers to connect the breadcrumbs. He underestimated the American devotion to the self-made man. Even today, 4 years after Corinne's book release, the narrative around Christopher McCandless remains relatively unchanged. No one searching for meaning between the lines. Waves of devotees still trek out to his magic bus, the place where he died after intentionally consuming neurotoxic berries. That is the biggest clue left in the book. The detail that Chris brought a guidebook on Alaskan botanicals with him. what so many moviegoers and book readers alike discuss at length is the great absurdity of his consumption of neurotoxic berries. Fans marvel at the tragedy, but of course, the bittersweet conclusion to an inspiring life only serves to heighten the grandeur of McCandless's image, as if the story of his life had been written by Shakespeare or Dostoevsky. But for Corinne, the tragedy here is not how Chris died, but that he planned his journey with the explicit purpose of killing himself. Because you see, instead of a 1990s Thoreau who personified independence and strength, her brother suffered with acute symptoms of complex PTSD, and his retreat from the world was a symptom of detachment rather than autonomy. Rather than the autonomous American hero, Chris McCandless experienced a horrifically abusive childhood that set the stage for long-lasting feelings of shame, worthlessness, isolation, and guilt. The world interpreted his affect dysregulation as strength and independence, and praised his risk-taking as if it had been prophetic rather than suicidal. We should find the adherence to the myth of McCandless disturbing. The fact that millions would rather pay homage to an incomplete characterization of a struggling man and ignore what Krakauer assumed would be obvious. That he, of course, was suffering from a trauma-related mental illness. His death was intentional, his journey highly reckless. Instead of reading between the lines, however, inspired readers fit Chris into a well-rooted American myth. The American pioneer who is self-made, is bold, and charts new territories. As Chris McCandless drowned in plain sight, millions of fans gathered to watch the highlights and repurpose them to fit our American narrative. The American vision of autonomy is typified by Henry David Thoreau and his book Walden Pond, and the version of Chris that Americans want is not the version with a disability or a victim of violence, but instead a neat and tidy image of an idealist. The irony of collapsing Christopher McCandless into a Gen X Thoreau is that Walden Pond is a work of fiction. Presented as though it was an autobiographical account of a year of isolation, the book shapes Thoreau into the ideal American naturalist, communing with nature alone, relying only on himself, portrayed the essential nature of a human being. But Thoreau, in reality, did not spend any extended time in isolation, but instead came home on the weekends, socialized, ate his standard foods, and maintained his own friendships. Any time that he spent in the so-called wilderness was in the context of social connectedness, and this provided him with his normal infrastructures. Because in contrast to the American ideals of independence and self-authoring, human beings do actually need one another to thrive. But before we hasten to think Americanism or Westernism is to blame for this hyper-autonomous human being, we Orthodox Christians also have autonomous heroes harvested from historical texts. Ours is the myth of the Desert Father. And our misunderstandings about independence and self-determination in historical Orthodox monasticism provide a dangerous interpretive social code that nourishes our implicit biases. Isolation becomes self-control, detachment becomes holiness, and we can quickly see how someone like Christopher McCandless would have been valorized not only as a modern-day Thoreau, but also as a modern-day St. Anthony, had he been Orthodox. And that is the mental image of a desert monastic, a Romantic-era poet casting off the world, leaving sin behind, that dictates the modern reception of monastic literature, including Serbian monastic Elder Thaddeus. We struggle to see monastics as dependent because, like Christopher McCandless, the image we want is of an impenetrable idealist, a woman or man of faith who becomes deified through their personal will and determination alone. Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives is one of the most concise compiled works on the topic of Eastern Orthodoxy and the power of thoughts. Several popular Orthodox platforms publish reviews of books. And for Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives, the vast majority of reviews opine about its positive impact for people with clinical depression. Now, confusion about what constitutes clinical depression aside, whether the reviewing author means depressive traits, depression as clinically assessed, or the actual mood disorder unipolar clinical depression. The perception by Matushka's priests and lay people alike is that Elder Thaddeus has something important to say regarding mental illness. In his chapter on thoughts, Elder Thaddeus explains, "Our life depends on the type of thoughts we nurture. If our thoughts are peaceful, calm, meek, and kind, then that is what our life will be like. If our attention is turned to the circumstances in which we live, we are drawn into a whirlpool of thoughts and can have neither peace nor tranquility. Everything, both good and evil, comes from our thoughts. Our thoughts become reality. Even today, we can see that all of creation, everything that exists on the earth or in the cosmos, is nothing but divine thought made material in time and space. We humans were created in the image of God, and humanity was given a great gift, but we hardly understand that. God's energy and life are in us, but we do not realize it. Neither do we realize that we greatly influence others with our thoughts. We can be very good or very evil, depending on the kinds of thoughts and desires we breed. If our thoughts are kind, peaceful, quiet, turned only toward the good, then we will influence ourselves and radiate peace around us, in our family, in the whole country, everywhere." When the Elder Thaddeus speaks of controlling our thoughts, Western readership reads the collective language as singular language, as if what he's really communicating is, you control your thoughts, instead of we control our thoughts. The difference is far from subtle and dramatically changes the meaning and spiritual application of the text. Discussing influencing others, Elder Thaddeus maintains collective language by saying, we influence ourselves. If he were thinking of a singular actor in isolation, this would certainly be an odd way to describe the person. How does one influence one's self? Certainly by exposing oneself to others. And here, what we see is the Orthodox community. If we participate in peaceful thoughts together, we will influence one another toward greater peace. Unfortunately, in our practice, our misinterpretations of monastic texts usually collapse this collective into a singularity. When the adult with complex PTSD reads the previous passage, the bit about internal family culture does not operate the same way it would for someone who comes from a healthy family establishment. Where typically a normally developed adult would assess the evil thoughts that Elder Thaddeus discusses as intended for the parents, clearly, the victims of parental violence would see themselves in that evil role, as if the child's own negative thoughts brought about the cosmic constellation of a curse upon them. As Elder Thaddeus continues, this inverted interpretation would only compound. He says, quote, "When there is evil in us, we radiate it among our family members and everywhere we go." He surmises, and the child who was raised in that violent family will always put themselves naturally into the role of the abuser as a result of a type of abused projection called parentification. The abusive attachment figure acts upon the child, early and often, with blame, shaming, arbitrary rulemaking to destabilize the child's sense of cause and effect, replacing it with grandiose expectations, placing the child in the role of the caretaker to the adult. Any violent or neglectful action on the part of the adult operates as a result of the child's original mistake. Thought, expression, as if the violence had been earned. The adult survivor of childhood trauma shows signs of parentification in their everyday relationships, often being the leader or the caretaker with an inflated sense of personal responsibility to others, to their own detriment. If Elder Thaddeus's words are taken to be individual rather than collective, it only causes their childhood abuse, it communicates to the person with complex PTSD that the intrusion of negative thoughts not only caused their childhood abuse, but also invalidates their faith in the present. Elder Thaddeus routinely places the weight of moral judgment for staving off the devil in individualistic terms, admonishing Christians that our starting place is always wrong when we want to change others before ourselves. Just think about how this affects someone like Christopher McCandless. He would be exceedingly, yes, I'll start with myself, the horrible thing that I am. Drawing from St. John Chrysostom, Thaddeus surmises, quote, "No one can harm the man who does not injure himself, not even the devil. So you see, we are the sole architects of our future," end quote. One could readily imagine this sort of phrase on a motivational poster or online meme. I saw reposted an article this week that is titled, "Trauma is not your fault, but healing is your responsibility." Would Elder Thaddeus have sentiments in common with our social media soundbite culture? When this sort of theology of soul agency is communicated to someone like Christopher McCandless, we cannot be surprised that adults with complex PTSD isolate themselves or conceal feelings of deep unworthiness. Telling a person who lacks the fundamental building blocks to recognize safety and danger to then spontaneously generate skills that come from loving experiences ignores that those skills for accepting love and recognizing safety come from the family system Elder Thaddeus assumes for his model of self-regulation. Assuming that a stable family is merely natural to human beings ignores the legacy of parental abuse in childhood, and it transforms it into something trivial, as if skills for life are innate. Echoing that no one can hurt the person who does not injure herself in the context of complex PTSD communicates back what the person already believes. I deserve abuse. I hurt myself first. Elder Thaddeus carries an individual model forward when he discusses the influence of others, further suggesting that as architects, we also bear the sole responsibility for structurally influencing others. So what is going on here? Is Elder Thaddeus shrill? Out of touch? Condemnatory of victims of trauma? A fan of individualism? No. I maintain that it is our interpretation that transforms him into a champion of independence and reduces his theology into mere power of positive thinking. Our modern bias causes us to miss key fundamental structures, and one in particular, in monastic literature, the psalmic style. The rhetorical collapse of collective language into singular actors gives the false impression that Elder Thaddeus fully expects the human being in isolation to avoid influence and maintain inner peace. But if we recall the dominant text of monastic prayer life, the Psalms, we are suddenly able to contextualize his rhetorical structure. King David routinely uses singular metaphors to represent the collective kingdom. Or he uses himself as the personification of the entire people's sin. When we read the Psalms, we also intuitively recognize that the language is inclusive rather than individual, drawing us into the text as singular members of a collective family. It would be a gross misreading to think of psalmic structure as individualistic, isolating, or singular. Vladimir Lossky explains that the Orthodox tradition must be definitionally critical if we hope to not repeat errors. He chides us for sometimes attributing spiritual significance to what he calls, quote, the stupid mistake of copyists. The passage of 200 years does not make something traditional. An modern Orthodox stupid mistake is certainly assuming that a singular moral agent is the operating agent in monastic literature, neglecting the psalmic style entirely. Our interpretations reinscribe this error, wrapping whole theologies around the delights of isolation, magnifying the myth of the desert monk as if the ideal type for the human being is one for whom needing others has become obsolete. Orthodox theology hinges on our participation with God. It hinges on the icon of the human being. So dependency is at the core of our ability to be saved, sanctified, and participate. Monastic language does not indicate an isolated moral actor. It is simply a rhetorical device that uses singular language to represent the collective. If we understand that the moral community is the agent in monastic text, how should our interpretation change when Elder Thaddeus cautions against negative, harmful, or evil thoughts because they form the foundation of violence in the world? How should a person for whom intrusive thoughts are a part of a clinical disorder relate to this theology? My contention is that Elder Thaddeus must be read with a high attention to specificity and context. Not only the context in which he wrote, but the context into which we hope to apply his words. Depression is not an uncomplicated experience. It does not come from a monolithic source, and we cannot flatten Orthodox theology into a shallow box in efforts to form a solution for people with distressing disabilities. We cannot rush and decontextualize in our attempts to get to the enjoyable taste of application. If we rush the setting of the banquet table and the preparation of good theology, we will ultimately leave vulnerable people out of our agape feast. And the largest threat present as it regards our thoughts determine our lives in the context of traumatic disability is that Orthodox theology might communicate that self-control, particularly of one's thoughts, is a prerequisite or sign of genuine Orthodox living, such that a person with intrusive thoughts would naturally conclude that by his or her own nature, they are permanently and innately out of communion. So how do we go about correcting our assumptions and misreadings? Firstly, we must understand the extreme danger of creating false histories. The Desert Fathers were not practitioners of independence, strength, fortitude, and personal virtue, but in fact, quite the opposite. Taking the life of St. Anthony as the primary example of anchoritic monasticism, his first cell was built onto the adjoining exterior wall of a church. A section of the ceiling was left open so that rain could be collected, and his bedpan could be lifted out on a rope by others. He lived in this closed cell, not to challenge other people's conception of what society was, but his own self-sufficiency. And he did this not by trusting God in an abstracted or esoteric way, but by trusting God's activity in other people. When, after over a decade, he emerged from the cell, people were astonished that he was physically well. It was his dependency that amazed them. Not that he had survived on a total lack of food, but the fact that he survived only on the food tossed to him by passers-by, the scraps and crusts that people happened to toss into his cell. It was not St. Anthony's faith that sustained him in some individualistic or abstracted way, but particularly his faith in others and their faith in him. We forget that monastics are actually empowered by the laity, that we literally provide for them when we buy candles or olive oil. If we choose not to depend on their industries, we cheat ourselves out of the internal dependency cultivated by traditional Orthodox living. We sustain them with our prayers, using the oil and the candles and the wicks that they have made for us, and they sustain us with their prayers and their cultivated sensitivity toward our needs. Together, we depend on one another in a perfect cycle. It is important to note that Christian faith is always reflected in the face of the other as the icon of Christ. We were created for this kind of dependency, this kind of need. Being needy, craving the support of others, is not a flaw, but it is the basic disposition of the human being. And while anchoritic monasticism may appear to represent isolation, we are mistaken if we do not define that sacramental commitment in its own context. Archdeacon John Krzyzewski explains that the desert monastic practice was vulnerability, saying, quote, "The intensity of retreat and silence are an opening up into the integrity of life and caring, as well as into the community of love and sharing. It is not an ascetic removal of need, but a redefining process that focuses our hearts on the very core of need, which is our dependency on God." Monasticism is about becoming more dependent, not about existing outside of humanity. The way the deep faith of monastics is oriented is not towards some personalized connectedness to God, just as the monastic and her personal Jesus in some sort of bubble, but toward a deep love for humanity as the beloved of the Creator. While it may be easier for us to readily relate to Cenobitic monasticism, that is, monasticism within monasteries and communities, the disciplines involved in both styles of monastic living as a whole are not intended to cultivate an interiorized independence like that of an American Romantic poet, but instead an acknowledgement of interdependence. Our skewed interpretation of monastic practice provides the environment for false histories to grow. Father Deacon Stephen Muse first developed a framework for false history syndrome as a part of what he calls post-traumatic spiritual disorder. In Father Deacon Stephen's profound assessment, the church has been complicit in social violences, either by active or passive engagement, and instantiates a type of detachment and false narrative to justify past actions and continue them into the present. In 2007, when Father Deacon Stephen first published this idea of post-traumatic spiritual disorder, the field of trauma theory and trauma studies was still very new, especially in the United States, as we recognized or really remembered again in the wake of a world conflict that soldiers actually require care after war. Go figure. I believe Father Deacon Stephen had his finger on the pulse of something new. However, with his descriptions of spiritualized detachment in the face of our own harms, and how that very specific type of denial using false histories as a justification lines up with specific aspects of traumatic injuries experienced by people who have, under duress, real or perceived, committed acts against their conscience. In 2010, trauma studies expert Jonathan Shea finally got on board with Father Deacon Stephen, introduced a classification describing just this, calling the aftermath of negative, pressured moral choices moral injury. Moral injury occurs when the moral agent faces pressure or coercion, again, real or perceived, to decide against their own morality in the context of trauma. But where Muse's analysis actually amplifies this is by pairing it with false history. The perceptive abilities of the person after trauma are compromised, and a common therapeutic support includes, as a primary clinical and to take steps then to regain their own moral grounding. So when false history syndrome operates within moral injury, we actually find the language to express how trauma furthers itself into the present by falsifying historical foundations that then skew the person's perception of present events. No objective timeline can be written when false history obscures the facts. Rather than exposing them to the light and through context and criticism, Orthodox false histories extract isolated meaning from historical context, use them to prop up a preconception, like a desert monk, our version, and then generalize the meaning to all people. Creating false histories is a uniquely damaging behavior for Orthodox Christians because we utilize so much historical theology in our everyday lives. Indeed, false history threatens the Orthodox sense of gospel because we will always be able to find a historical example of uncharity, judgment, and flippantness in our tradition to justify ourselves if we go looking. If historicity is our only litmus test rather than truth, our theology becomes what Christ condemns in the parable of the talents, a mere gift that has been buried in the ground for only preservation's sake. Muse details many aspects of false history syndrome within his post-traumatic spiritual disorder, and I have distilled them into categories for today's discussion. I have three. There are three movements to create a false history: decontextualization, appropriation, and generalization. I'll be repeating them often. When we remove text or an element of practice from its native environment and history without robust argumentation for why and how it applies to the present, we ignore the context that made that original practice intelligible in the first place. Taking that decontextualized practice to use for our own purposes without giving a robust critical account for how we translate that history into our present lives is appropriation. We stand in conflict with our tradition when we believe, even unknowingly, that past events amount to golden nuggets of wisdom for us now, as if we are the apex of history rather than Christ. And inevitably, when we apply that isolated historical tidbit to the present, we generalize. We generalize the meaning of it outside of its original and internal logic. Decontextualization leads to fundamental misunderstandings of text and meaning. Appropriation disrupts our reception of the tradition by placing us as the owners of tradition rather than participants with it. And finally, generalization pushes the conclusions from those misunderstandings into the present, irrespective of present context. If we operate within the false history of monastics being independent, isolated, romantic poet types who sought seclusion to avoid the noise and sin of society, then we are setting ourselves up for misinterpreting their texts. Modern theologians often collapse monastic insights into general wisdom without translating the essential differences between these two sacramental commitments. Paul Evdokimov, for example, introduces the term interiorized monasticism. What he describes with this language, however, is not interiorized monasticism, but interiorized asceticism. Interiorized monasticism would indicate somehow that the monastic lifestyle can be encapsulated for universal digestion, regardless of your sacramental commitments. This is certainly not what Evdokimov intends, but rather he highlights a strain of practice that is shared between monastics and laypersons, what Father John Baer describes as shared asceticism. Baer explains that monasticism and marriage are not in competition with one another, as though it was monastic versus laity, or holiness versus common life, or Navy versus Army. But rather, we are practicing two different types of asceticism. So we would be remiss to think of monastics when we think of ascetics. For all Orthodox Christians are ascetics. The differentiation between us is not whether or not we practice asceticism, but how we practice asceticism. When our thoughts determine our lives is collapsed into an individualistic and personalistic false history, where the layperson is desperately trying to play monk to experience the, quote, real Orthodox life, Elder Thaddeus becomes extreme, judgmental, and out of touch because his insights were not for the present moment or for the isolated person. For Serbian Orthodox Christians, however, he is a great rebuilder of the faith because they see him in his correct context. Rather than out of touch, Elder Thaddeus is deeply entwined within the moral wasteland in Serbia, resulting from 3 waves of genocide. Those 3 waves would be World War II, which he was captured in, the Croatian genocide against Serbs, and then the Serbian genocide against Bosnians that sparked and precipitated the NATO bombing of Kosovo. So Elder Thaddeus lived through all of these, all back-to-back, 3 genocides. None of those cultural markers or deep wounds or moral needs are applicable to everyday parish life, especially not to someone casually recommending a book on thoughts to someone they see struggling with visible depression. Elder Thaddeus was extreme because the needs of the people were dire. And his harsh advice, despite an individualistic tone, was not given for the person in isolation from others, which we can clearly see when we understand the communal nature of monastic literature. Ironically, it is exactly this stripping out of the context of mass trauma from Elder Thaddeus's work that makes his reflections harmful. Decontextualizing, appropriating, and generalizing removes the connection Elder Thaddeus would have otherwise had with victims of extended trauma. The Elder Thaddeus, who faced 3 waves of institutional violence, counseled parents and children in the aftermath of ethnic cleansing, and oversaw the repentance of direct perpetrators and those in the church complicit with horrible acts of violence. This is the man we should be running to. When we see his highly particular context, his harshness becomes intelligible. And we are able to see that his fire is not aimed at wounded children functioning in adult bodies, struggling to keep out memories of past violence. Instead, his holy anger is actually directed toward the abusers of those abusers whose evil thoughts manifested destruction on entire people groups and threatened the fabric of the Orthodox moral tradition. We also see that we are not the subjects of his writings. Applying his thoughts in our context in a generalized way is very reckless. It does not honor his contribution to the church, and it does not honor his own dependency on context, prayer, and community. Elder Thaddeus, like any other monastic, is also subject to sin. If we imagine Elder Thaddeus to be discussing unspecified depression, we miss the profound wisdom of seeking God in the midst of trauma. Indeed, in context, Elder Thaddeus's words about thoughts determining our lives, the world around us, and the possibilities for our future after violence do not communicate that intrusive thoughts disqualify the victim of child abuse from the world of faith. But instead, he forcefully reminds us that we are in this process of becoming more faithful together. Just as the markers of false history are, once again, decontextualization, appropriation, and generalization, the opposing movements mark true historical engagement. The marks of accurate historical interpretation are contextualization, attribution, and particularization. When applying historical theological context to current concerns, these should be the attributes we knowingly strive for and also require from the theologies that we accept. Contextualization, attribution, particularization. Orthodox Christians, we know that the human being is made in the image of God. The human being is an icon. We know that the human being, regardless of trauma, is created by a good God as naturally good. But we underestimate how difficult it is to actually retain that belief in real life. Everywhere humanity is fallen, crumbling, and injuring itself. And it is in the midst of this brokenness somehow that we are images of God. This sounds absurd. What is the nature of the human being? How can we be both capable of abuse and so vulnerable as to be dynamically changed by childhood acts of violence? The human being is like a painted icon. Despite its original grandeur and gilding, if subjected to environmental factors like heat, humidity, and force, the tempera will split, the gold leaf will crack, and the image, once beautiful in its reflection and likeness, will flake off into broken pieces. If we develop under conditions that include abuse, violence, and duress, that negative environmental pressure will alter the chemical and psychological organization of the self and create lasting fault lines for the adult. But everything in theology hinges on but. We also know that with the right materials and environment, icons can be restored. The community of faith provides those materials, and it is our diligence in countering our own tendencies toward bias and false history making that allows us to participate with the survivor of abuse in their own restoration into the family of God. There are optimal materials for icons. Some minerals make better ground for tempera, some woods make better boards, linen of a certain grade and rabbit glue of a certain thickness. These materials make for long-lasting images, crisp lines, and boards that will not warp or bend over time. The same is true for the human being. An optimal developmental foundation enables a higher level of spiritual ease, more direct access to moral choice, a clearer line between positive and negative behaviors, all which grow from a well-established root system that tells the person who they are: worthy, good, and loved. But we also know attachment is a lifelong process, and while the adult may not be able to literally be born again into a new family with loving parents, the church can offer a community full of attachment figures who can bit by bit partner to struggle with rather than against the person healing from complex PTSD. Trusted others are the ideal materials for restoration. We are the gilding and the pigment. Each of us is in the process of becoming a human being, not in isolation, but all as icons in the Master's studio, together becoming perfected as we participate in one another's development. This is the good news, the gospel for victims of childhood trauma. We are all still developing, and the writing of your icon has not been completed yet. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, we have a few minutes for questions, so let's see what we can do. Oh, is there? Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. So you can answer here, and both will be recorded.
Perfect.
And We'll play this by ear. The next session is at 4:15, but right here in the atrium. So if you have a few minutes for questions for Kate.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for inspiring lecture. Would you mind just elaborating for a brief second this false history syndrome for me? What?
Yes.
How can you define that? And then also in regards to Holy Father Tadej, Serbians call him Tadej. Are you saying that, for example, his most famous book that we have available, should that be shared to people who are suffering?
Sharing books in a parish context is a little sticky because we have a habit of sharing things we like that we find meaningful, right? But in the handing off of the book, there's not necessarily a partnership. I think any book of theology is best read in a group, right? I think that with attention to context, it's fine to hand our thoughts determine our lives. My husband and I have gotten so much out of it. But as Americans, we have a tendency to read things for ourselves, you know? And so in the act of charity, which is giving someone something that you think might be very helpful, you're leaving a lot up to chance, right? And as people who aren't clinicians and aren't in a clinical context either, right? Even if you are in a clinician, you can clock out when you go to church. We might be mistaken. Complex PTSD is often misdiagnosed for bipolar disorder, clinical depression, a whole host of things, because we're reading everybody based on affect. I mean, even a clinician in clinic is going to be judging you based on what appears to be true over the course of time, you know? And it's in that context that individualism becomes so dangerous, you know? So I think, yeah, if you have a close relationship with someone and you recognize that this person is struggling with something that looks depressive, the correct context for anything there is a high level of participation in that person's life, right? And in that context, give them anything to read you want, right?
But particularly this book.
Yeah, particularly this book. I mean, there's a huge foreword in the beginning of the English translation that gives the context. But especially outside of the Serbian context, we don't, you know, the average American in an Orthodox parish isn't aware of the social context for Serbia. And it's extremely interwoven.
And it should be read with the context.
Right. So the foreword does its best, but there's a lot of additional research you would need to do. And because of that, the threat level is quite high that someone reading it because they're depressed and looking to Elder Thaddeus to say, you know, how should I handle my own personal depression? His answers are not for how you should handle your own personal depression. His answers are how you should establish a moral life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And depression might come from a whole host of things, including a corrupted moral life, right? But as a friend, but even as the person, even as the depressed person, even as the person with complex PTSD who knows, you know, all this comes from a family system, the way we experience things is in real time. We don't have the ability to kind of look at ourselves objectively. So my caution in this paper is just to be aware of the contextual factors, both for when he was writing this and also where we're applying it. And I completely trust that if we do that, the Holy Spirit partners with us,
Yes.
you know? And the Holy Spirit may partner when we mess up, when we're hasty and we just want to solve a problem out of. And I don't think parishioners are trying to do something wrong. I think we have great love for people who are struggling, and we want so badly to take that away, right? So read this book. I found it so meaningful, in hopes, prayer that this is going to help. But when we do that, we need to be cognizant of all the moving pieces in as much as we are able, knowing that whenever we fail, because we will, the Holy Spirit will make up the gaps.
And the false history syndrome?
False history syndrome, be better explained by Father Deacon Stephen Muse. So read everything he's ever written. But the way that I collapsed it, because he goes through huge swaths of particularly American history, and the ways in which the church has covered things up and also detached ourselves from things that have happened that we should have been aware of and involved in, like chattel slavery. It's a part of American history. For the sake of this presentation, I categorized them. So for my digestion, the movements of false history are when we take something out of context, like Elder Thaddeus' words taken out of the Serbian context, plopped into the middle of like puritanical Americanism, like he was an evangelical, and say, this is accurate because I want to use it for something. That's appropriation. You already have in mind, I want to make this individual so I can read it in my Orthodox quiet time, whatever that might be. I say that in heavy quotes. I want to digest this for myself. That's appropriation. And then inevitably, we generalize that to people. So a generalization for a person with complex PTSD would be, I don't understand why you're struggling so much. You should just control your thoughts, right? That's a generalization. That, again, I don't think we say because we're jerks. I think we say because...
To simplify it into...
Yes, we're not understanding that we're behaving as though we are the owners of all these pieces, and we are not, right? We are participators with the tradition, and we need to constantly be telling ourselves that so that we don't get this inflated ego that thinks that I can take all these pieces out of context and not do anything with it, just like a buffet line.
Take it for granted.
Right, exactly, and put pieces together that wouldn't go together. Like, you can't imagine Elder Thaddeus saying something like, your family life doesn't matter, I don't care that everyone died. I don't care that you lived through genocide, you should just buck up, right? That would be ridiculous. When we see it in context, then we can see how we're supposed to participate with the tradition.
I think we had another question. And if we can try to speed it up, are you okay with a few more minutes?
Sure.
Are you all okay? For
Sweating like a
couple
devil.
more minutes? Okay.
Yes.
Let's try to go back there.
Is that okay?
And if you need to leave, go ahead. But
Thank you.
we're still meeting, so. Hey.
Thank you so much for this. It was amazing. So I'm thinking when I was listening to this, I'm coming maybe from attachment theory background
Sure.
and an angle. So I'm thinking I want to move towards a secure attachment. I don't want avoidant attachment because avoidant attachment could feed into the complex PTS trauma and cause worse severe symptoms.
The problem with
Yeah.
using Bowlby for
Sure.
secure attachment,
Yeah.
though, is that he thinks of war,
Okay, he thinks
not
of-
internal family violence.
Okay.
So I mentioned John Bowlby. His paradigms are secure attachment and insecure attachment. And insecure attachment for Bowlby is like poverty,
sure.
or incarceration, things that I think are easier to connect with, right? Whereas family systems theory lends a lot to Bessel van der Kolk because he's looking at internal violences of an abusive parent who's not being coerced by any means to be violent toward a child.
And then, so then if, maybe to elaborate more, I think you did talk about this at the end of like, so if we want to form that more greater bond attachment, creating trusting individuals, how else would you describe, like if you want to move toward those healthy, just attachment styles, any type of style,
Sure.
healthy bonds.
Okay, so my recommendation is to make sure this does not all fall on your confessor,
Okay.
right? The lady, we do a terrible job of overworking our priests. And it is just, another trauma waiting to happen when you put a man called father in front of a person who's experienced abuse and expect him to be that healthy attachment figure, right? It'll also, if you don't make a plan pastorally, because all of us are responsible for each other, if you don't make a plan for a person that you know who's experienced family violence to help establish these secure attachments, that person will go through, no fault of their own, and exhaust the living daylights out of everyone, sucking the life out of everyone. And they are not doing this out of some sort of malice or sin. They are doing this out of acute need, right? So what needs to happen in our parish is that we make a plan, right? 15 minutes from everybody is sustainable, not 25 hours of this person codependently sucking everything out of each individual, right? Because then we can't support each other as we support that person. We need to remember that we're Orthodox, right? So the person who is securely attached, had an ideal Orthodox family, super well rooted in their faith, they want to help this person. That person is also dependent. The person who faced abuse is not the only one who's dependent. All of us are dependent, right? So as someone is meeting the needs of someone else, everyone else has to think about how to meet the needs of the support figure as well. We need to remember that dependency doesn't just come from harm. Dependency is how we were created. Hope that answers your question.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're going to need to end. But the next session starts in 5 minutes, so I'm so sorry, but I know we'd love to talk for 30 more minutes. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you again.